Stop it. Stop resisting. Chelsea, this is a welfare check.
The sun was bright over the quiet streets of Baraboo, but the mood in the neighborhood was far from peaceful. It all started with a series of frantic phone calls to the police department. Residents were worried about a woman named Arsenal Briggs who was wandering through the local alleyways. She wasn't just walking, she was carrying her young son, Jax, and stopping at every house she passed. The neighbors told the police that Arsenal was banging loudly on their front doors. When people opened their doors to see what was wrong, they found a woman who seemed completely lost. She was asking for help, but her words didn't make any sense. One neighbor reported that she was talking nonsense, jumping from one scary idea to the next without stopping to breathe. People watched through their windows as she moved from porch to porch. She looked tired and stressed, clutching Jax tightly as if she were running away from something invisible. The community was used to quiet afternoons, so the sight of a mother acting so strangely was upsetting to everyone. They didn't know if she was sick, scared, or dangerous, but they knew that something was terribly wrong. By the time the police cruisers pulled into the area, the neighborhood was on edge. The officers were told they were there for a simple welfare check to make sure the mom and the boy were safe. However, as they spoke to the witnesses, they realized this wasn't going to be a normal day. Arsenal had disappeared behind one of the doors, leaving a trail of confusion and worry behind her. The officers began to search for the house where the knocking had finally stopped, unaware that they were walking straight into a total nightmare. The police soon found the house where Arsenal Briggs was staying. It belonged to a man named Waylon, who was standing outside when the officers arrived. He looked worried and told the officers that Arsenal had been running around the area and banging on people's doors. Inside the house, the officers finally saw Arsenal. She was clutching her young son, Jax, very tightly. The room was small and cluttered, which made the whole situation feel even more crowded and tense. Officer Holloway stepped into the house and tried to keep his voice calm. He asked Arsenal to have a seat and to watch over her little one. Arsenal looked up at him, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and confusion. She told the officer her name was Arsenal, but she seemed very jumpy. She kept looking toward the door and then back at Waylon, who she called Dad. The officers explained that they were only there to make sure she and Jax were okay. However, Arsenal did not seem to believe them. She began to talk about being scared and mentioned that her own mother was worried about her losing her mind. She kept saying that she was terrified of losing her son to people who did not even exist. Even though the officers were trying to be helpful, the air in the room felt heavy. Arsenal was sitting on the edge of her seat, ready to bolt at any second. Waylon stood nearby, caught between wanting to help Arsenal and wanting to follow the officers' orders. It was clear that this welfare check was not going to be a simple conversation. The den was filled with a strange energy, and the officers knew they had to be careful as they tried to figure out what was really happening with Arsenal Briggs. As the officers stood in the room, Arsenal Briggs began to speak about things that made the situation feel much more serious. She told Officer Holloway that she was in the middle of a technological warfare. Her voice was shaky as she explained that she was being attacked through advanced technology that no one else could see. She seemed to believe that her life was in danger and that she needed special protection. Arsenal then made some very strange requests. She asked the officers to get her a Bible and mentioned someone named St. John. She seemed to think that religious figures were the only ones who could help her win this invisible war. She even looked at the officer's belt and asked him to have his gun ready, which made everyone in the room feel very uneasy. It was clear that in her mind, a massive battle was happening right there in the living room. Waylon tried to stay calm, but it was hard to listen to Arsenal talk about Zion and people that did not exist. She wasn't just confused, she was living in a completely different world. The officers realized that they weren't just dealing with a woman who was lost. They were dealing with someone who truly believed that machines and spirits were fighting against her. This digital war was only happening in her head, but for Arsenal, it was a total nightmare that she couldn't escape. As the strange talk about digital wars continued, the officers knew they needed to identify exactly who they were talking to. Officer Holloway asked Arsenal Briggs for her ID card so he could figure out her last name. This started a long and frustrating struggle. Arsenal seemed confused by the simple request, and instead of handing over a card, she began reaching into various bags around her. The officers grew worried as she dug through her belongings. They repeatedly asked her to stop reaching into the bags and to just sit down. Arsenal's focus was scattered. One moment she was looking for her ID, and the next she was complaining that the officers' flashlights were too bright for her eyes. She claimed her ID was in her name, but she couldn't seem to produce it or even spell her own last name correctly for the officers. Waylon stood nearby, watching the confusion grow. The officers turned to him, asking if this behavior was normal for her. Arsenal interrupted, saying her mother was afraid she was losing her mind, but she insisted she was fine. Every time the officers thought they were close to getting her name, she would change the subject back to her son or her fears. What should have been a 30-second task turned into a slow, difficult battle for information, making the officers realize that Arsenal was not going to make anything easy for them. The atmosphere in the house was becoming too tense for a young child. Officer Holloway decided it was best for Jax to be away from the growing confusion. He gently asked the little boy to go with his grandpa, Waylon, to the back of the house. The officer explained that they just needed to talk to his mom for a few minutes. Waylon agreed and took the boy away from the center of the room, hoping to keep him calm while the police dealt with Arsenal. As soon as Jax was out of sight, Arsenal's fear spiked. She watched her son leave and immediately began to worry about what the police were planning. She turned to the officers and told them they were not going to put her under. Even though Officer Holloway tried to reassure her that they weren't going to do anything like that, Arsenal wouldn't listen. She was convinced that because she had been on video, something bad was about to happen to her. Arsenal's breathing became faster as she looked at the door and then back at the officers. She kept repeating that she didn't want to lose her son. The separation from Jax, which was meant to protect him, only made Arsenal feel more like she was in a trap. The quiet conversation was over, and the officers could see that Arsenal was preparing to fight. The room felt smaller than ever as the officers got ready to tell her the news that would change everything. The mood in the house changed in an instant. Officer Holloway received a message through his radio that changed the whole situation. He looked at Arsenal Briggs and told her the truth: she had an active warrant for her arrest. He told her she needed to stand up because she was being placed under arrest. Arsenal's face went pale, and she immediately began to shake her head. She couldn't believe what was happening. No! Oh my God, no, she screamed as the officers moved closer. Officer Holloway tried to keep things safe by asking her to put down the items she was holding so they wouldn't get ruined. But Arsenal was not listening anymore. She was terrified and started to pull away from the officers. She kept shouting no, over and over again, her voice getting louder and more desperate. The officers grabbed her arms to put on the handcuffs, but Arsenal began to fight back. She was not just scared, she was determined to get away. She even told them that she wasn't Kelsey, trying to claim they had the wrong person. The officers told her to relax and stop resisting, but the total nightmare had truly begun. The calm welfare check was gone, and the small living room was now a place of a violent struggle. Arsenal was fighting with everything she had, even though the law was already closing in on her. The struggle in the living room turned into a total nightmare as Arsenal Briggs fought with every bit of her strength. As soon as the officers tried to put the handcuffs on her, she began to scream and thrash around. The officers had to take her to the floor to keep her from hurting herself or them. Arsenal's screams filled the house as she begged Waylon to help her, crying out "Dad, please," over and over again. On the ground, the scene was pure chaos. Arsenal was flailing her arms and legs, making it almost impossible for the officers to secure the handcuffs. One officer shouted for her to stop resisting and to put her hands behind her back, but she continued to fight. She was shouting about the Holy Trinity and Mother Mary, showing that she was still trapped in her own scary thoughts even during the physical fight. Waylon stood nearby, watching in shock as the woman he knew completely lost control. The officers were breathing hard, their uniforms getting messy as they rolled on the floor with Arsenal. Every time they thought they had her arms, she would twist away and scream again. The small room felt like a battlefield, and the total nightmare that had been building all afternoon had finally reached its most violent point. The fight on the floor was not stopping, and the officers were reaching their breaking point. Arsenal Briggs was still twisting her body and kicking, making it impossible for the police to finish putting on the handcuffs. Officer Holloway was breathing hard and knew he had to end the struggle before someone got seriously hurt. He reached for his belt and pulled out his taser, pointing it toward Arsenal to show her he was serious. "Stop it! You're about to get tossed," the officer shouted over her screams. He told her that if she kept fighting, he would have no choice but to use the device. Waylon watched from the corner, his face full of worry, as he realized how close things were to getting even worse. The threat of the taser finally seemed to reach Arsenal through her panic. Even though she was still crying and talking about Mother Mary, Arsenal's body started to go limp. She stopped kicking long enough for the officers to finally click the metal handcuffs around her wrists. The room was suddenly quieter, filled only with the sound of Arsenal's heavy sobbing and the officers trying to catch their breath. The most dangerous part of the total nightmare was over, but Arsenal was still far away from reality. The officers stood up, tired and messy, ready to move her out of the house and into the waiting patrol car. As the officers let Arsenal Briggs out of the house, the chaos of the struggle slowly began to fade, but her mind was still racing. They placed her in the back of the patrol car, and as the door clicked shut, Arsenal started to speak again. Her voice was no longer screaming, but it was filled with strange ideas that made the officers realize her total nightmare was far from over. While sitting in the back seat, Arsenal began to tell the officers about her family and her past. She claimed that she had seen a man named Chris who was dead, and she firmly believed that his soul was attached to hers. She spoke as if these spirits were real people sitting right next to her. She even told the officers that she had received a secret message from St. John and promised she was telling the truth. Arsenal also seemed confused about her own body. She told the officers multiple times that she didn't think she was pregnant, even though no one had asked her about it. When the officers asked if her behavior was normal, she insisted it wasn't, but she couldn't explain why she was acting this way. She looked out the window at Waylon's house and suddenly said, "This isn't my house either," showing that she was completely lost in her own world. The car ride was quiet except for Arsenal's rambling. The officers listened as she jumped from one delusion to the next, talking about God's name and her real dad. Even though she was now safely in the back of the car, Arsenal Briggs was still trapped in a digital and spiritual war that no one else could see. The physical fight had ended, but the battle inside her head was still going strong. The long afternoon finally came to an end at the county jail. After the scary struggle in the living room and the strange ride in the patrol car, Arsenal Briggs was taken to the hospital to make sure she was okay. Even while she was at the hospital, she was still acting unhinged and tried to run away from the officers one last time. She was eventually brought back and moved to the Sauk County Jail to face the consequences of the nightmare she had caused. The legal part of the story was very serious. Arsenal was charged with two main things: resisting an officer and disorderly conduct. When it was time for her court date, she chose to enter a no-contest plea, which means she did not fight the charges against her. The judge found her guilty on both counts because of all the trouble that happened during the welfare check. As her final punishment, Arsenal was told she had to pay the court a total of $434.20. The total nightmare that started with a simple knock on a neighbor's door ended with a heavy fine and a criminal record. Arsenal's journey through the digital war in her head led her straight into the real-world hands of the law, proving that even a routine check can turn into a life-changing event.